Before we begin today's webinar, I do want to acknowledge that we are all meeting today on the lands of the traditional owners. Here in Canberra for us at Aracy, that's the lands of the Ngunnawal people. We wanted to pay our respects and the respects of this entire group to Indigenous elders, past, present, and to those emerging. And we want to acknowledge both the ongoing contribution that Indigenous Australians play to our country, but also the results of yesterday's Closing the Gap report, which for me certainly is a major driving factor of why Aracy continues to exist and why we continue to do the work that we do. I want to spend a small moment introducing today's speaker and today's webinar. The title for our webinar is the Early Years Summit 2020, Unpacking the Theory and Practice of Systems Change. And I want to emphasise that the summit very much is about a systems change approach to looking at how we can look better at the early years in Australia. Our speaker today is Kerry Graham from Collaboration for Impact. Kerry is one of Australia's leading systems change thinkers, and we are delighted to have Kerry not only here with us today, but as our lead facilitator at the National Early Years Summit. I'm sure you're all aware by now that Aracy and our partners, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, Families Australia, PIRI, Good Start Early Learning and Children's Healthcare Australasia are combining to host the National Early Years Summit in only 3 weeks from now. The National Early Years Summit is a piece of accelerated systems change. We are trying to accelerate what is often a longer process by bringing leading thinkers from around the country and hopefully many of you into one place for 2 intensive days of thinking, of discussing, of debating, of hopefully challenging one another in new and different ways. And we're going to look to Kerry and her team to really drive that and to ensure that we maintain our systems change focus. I'm going to hand over now to Kerry. I'm sure she's going to impart a lot of knowledge about systems change and about how the summit is a key part of that. So thank you for your time, and over to you, Kerry.
Appreciate the welcome. It's great to be with everyone on this call, and I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners, in my case the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I can see we have 112 people online, so welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to be in this conversation with you. My plan is just to spend a little bit of time today going through at a very high level the theory of systems change, and then another high level overview of what is the practice of systems change, and particularly how this will play out in the summit that hopefully we're all going to be at together in a couple of weeks. So one of the things that when we talk about systems change, what we're thinking of is there is clearly a system that exists around children, young children and their families. That system in some ways is very easy to identify. Families themselves, the service providers and health systems and housing systems that support families and their very young children. But there are also parts of that system that are perhaps a little bit less visible. The policies and incentives in the system, the way money moves, access to family sustaining wages, access to an environment that supports the healthy thriving of children. All of these things make up the system that support children, young children in Australia to thrive. So when we approach the work of improving outcomes for all young children in Australia and their families, there is great benefit in taking a systems lens to that work. So let's start with some pretty hopefully accessible definitions. So a system is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, whatever, as the famous Daniela Meadows has quoted, that interconnect in such a way that they produce their own patterns of behaviour over time. And it's really these patterns of behaviour or structures, conditions that we're looking to change in order to create better outcomes. So another perhaps cleaner way of talking about systems change is thinking about what are the conditions we need to shift that those conditions are holding a problem in place or a set of unacceptable outcomes in place. So when we think about young children in Australia, What are the conditions or behaviours in the system that are keeping poor outcomes for some young children in Australia and their families in place? These are some of the questions we're going to be turning our mind to at the summit. When would we use a systems change approach to a set of outcomes that we're deeply dissatisfied about? So all of the literature and in fact the practice tells us that we would only take a systems change approach if the challenge that we're grappling with is indeed complex. So let's just spend a minute framing up what a complex problem is. We would know if we have a complex problem if they are difficult to frame. Now that means that there are many different narratives or storylines about what actually is the challenge we're grappling with, or what actually are the solutions we should be pursuing. So we know in early childhood people arrive at the work of improving outcomes from very different frames to each other, a health frame, a developmental frame, a child rights frame, as well as families coming at it from I want the best for my child and I need a family sustaining income to create those outcomes. So everyone has a different frame. The relationship between the cause of poor outcomes and then the effects of poor outcomes sometimes can be very unclear, the cause and effect in the system. There are many, many stakeholders, all who care deeply about better outcomes, and each of their experiences can be different and unique, but none of their experiences is wrong. We know we've got a complex problem when the characteristics of the issue that we're grappling with can change. Sometimes can change slowly, but equally can change quite rapidly. And that there's no obvious right or wrong set of solutions, or at least there's no widely accepted right or wrong set of solutions, and that it's hard to measure success. So even in going through this introductory sort of criteria for what is a complex problem, I'm hoping many of you might sit there and apply this to your work around improving outcomes for young children in Australia and think, yes, many of the things we're grappling with, or many characteristics of the change we're trying to create have these have this criteria. So how do you then change systems? What is the approach? So at a very high level, moving away from theory and towards practice, systems change when we diagnose the system we are operating in very well. That's the first step. And then from that understanding of how does the system operate now, what are the conditions in the system, the behaviours in the system that produce these unacceptable outcomes, once we understand that, we then start forming hypotheses. Well, if we know the system is operating in this way at this time, where can we intervene in that system in order to shift those conditions or shift those patterns that are producing unacceptable outcomes? And once we've formed our hypotheses about where we might best intervene, we then need to say, well, which one of these or which grouping of these is actually going to create the most amount of change for the most amount of children? So where are the high leverage points in the system where if we intervened, it would cause significant disruption to those conditions or behaviours in the system and create better outcomes? And because systems never stand still, they're always changing, we can never just set and forget these interventions that we've determined. We've got to intervene in the system and then watch what occurs. Hopefully what occurs is movement towards the outcomes we're looking for, but many times there's unintended outcomes. So we need to watch, adapt our interventions quite rapidly and be in a constant learning loop. So at its core, systems change is when you are intentionally trying to create a new set of patterns or conditions or behaviours in the system around children. So let's have a look at some of these just very briefly in more detail. Step one is to diagnose the system. Some systems change initiatives do very detailed maps of how does the system operate now? What are the conditions and behaviours in the system? What are the interdependencies? That's one school of thought. There is another school of thought that says those people that are within the system, they're the beneficiaries or users of the system, when you bring them together, they have an inherent deep understanding of how the system works, and mapping it can be useful but not always necessary. The reason I wanted to talk about mapping the system is it's a useful way for diagnosing, but when we look at a systems map, it can be very overwhelmingly complex. But systems change is trying to find the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So we're just going to take a short break here and launch a video, a 2-minute video. It's a TED talk that shows us how diagnosing the system can help us work out what leverage, where we should be intervening in a very simple way.
Do you ever feel completely overwhelmed when you're faced with a complex problem? Well, I hope to change that in less than 3 minutes. So I hope to convince you that complex doesn't always equal complicated. So for me, a well-crafted baguette fresh out of the oven is complex. But a curry, onion, green olive, poppy cheese bread is complicated. I'm an ecologist and I study complexity. I love complexity. And I study that in the natural world, the interconnectedness of species. So here's a food web, or a map of feeding links between species that live in alpine lakes in the mountains of California. And this is what happens to that food web when it's stocked with non-native fish that never lived there before. All the grayed out species disappear. Some are actually on the brink of extinction. And lakes with fish have more mosquitoes, even though they eat them. These effects are all unanticipated, and yet we're discovering they're predictable. So I want to share with you a couple key insights about complexity we're learning from studying nature that maybe are applicable to other problems. First is the simple power of good visualization tools to help untangle complexity and just encourage you to ask questions you didn't think of before. For example, you could plot the flow of carbon through corporate supply chains in a corporate ecosystem, or the interconnections of habitat patches for endangered species in Yosemite National Park. The next thing is that if you want to predict the effect of one species on another, if you focus on only that link and then you black box the rest, it's actually less predictable than if you step back, consider the entire system, all the species, all the links, and from that place, hone in on the sphere of influence that matters most. And we're discovering with our research that's often very local to the node you care about, within 1 or 2 degrees. So the more you step back, embrace complexity, the better chance you have of finding simple answers, and it's often different than the simple answer that you started with. So let's switch gears and look at a really complex problem, courtesy of the US government. This is a diagram of the US counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It was front page of the New York Times a couple months ago, instantly ridiculed by the media for being so crazy complicated. And the stated goal was to increase popular support for the Afghan government. Clearly a complex problem, but is it complicated? Well, when I saw this in front page of the Times, I thought, great, finally something I can relate to. You know, I can sink my teeth into this. So let's do it. So here you go, for the first time ever, a world premiere view of this spaghetti diagram as an ordered network. The circled node is the one we're trying to influence, popular support for the government. And so now we can look 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees away from that node and eliminate like 3/4 of the diagram outside that sphere of influence. Within that sphere, most of those nodes are not actionable, like the harshness of the terrain, and a very small minority are actual military actions. Most are nonviolent, and they fall into 2 broad categories: active engagement with ethnic rivalries and religious beliefs, and fair, transparent economic development and provisioning of services. I don't know about this, but this is what I can decipher from this diagram in 24 seconds. When you see a diagram like this, I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to be excited. I want you to be relieved, because simple answers may emerge. We're discovering in nature that simplicity often lies on the other side of complexity. So for any problem, the more you can zoom out and embrace complexity, the better chance you have of zooming in on the simple details that matter most. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I hope that video was a useful way of thinking about the benefits of mapping the system collectively in order to work out where are the places that we should intervene, and finding that actually when you do bring people together to map the system, it can become quite clear, quite simple in a way, to work out where are the places we should be intervening the most. If we diagnose the system, if that was step 1, we've got to think about there are many places in a system where you can intervene. And not all places to intervene are high leverage, which means not all places produce large-scale change. So some of the useful tools in systems thinking are to think about grouping the types of interventions we can make. So when we think about this, the iceberg model, a lot of what we see in the system surrounding young children is what's happening, what are the events, the services offered, the number of times people turn up to things. But really what we're looking for is below the waterline. What are the patterns of behaviours, the trends that we're seeing over time? What are the structures? How do different parts of the system relate to each other and what influences those patterns? And underneath at the very bottom of the iceberg are the mental models that exist in the system. Now these are never explicit, but these are what are the values and assumptions we have as a society about children and families that are shaping the way we structure the system and the way the patterns of the system play out. If we start intervening at those levels, we have a chance of completely transforming the system. So here's another representation of the same concept, which is there are different places to intervene in the system and some of them are very visible. The ones that are visible are quite naturally the ones we focus on most when we come together to think about change. What are the policies most impacting on young children and families? What are the practices that are happening in our services and in our policy making or in our families that are impacting on young children? And how do resources flow? Now, the most obvious one is money, but resources include things like how does data flow? Who has access to the data? How do ideas flow? Whose ideas get preferenced? So all of these things are important to systems change. They're visible and they actually change the structure of the system, but they may be very low leverage interventions in the system. So if we move to the next level, things that are semi-visible, it's the relationships and connections between the system, different parts of the system or actors within it. So we know from a service delivery perspective, services are very fragmented, siloed. There's a constant narrative about the way support is provided to families and children. So if we create stronger connections and relationships between different parts of the systems, then the patterns will change. The way people use power and pool power matters a lot in systems change. So those that are the users of the system, children and families, are usually the most powerless over the things that can change the system. So policy, practices, relationships and connections, influencing the way money flows. Those who are in power are very vested with the system staying the way it is. So shifting the power dynamics in the system and bringing in the experience of lived experience, but also how people with lived experience can become decision makers and influencers of change is very important to disrupting the patterns in order to produce better outcomes. And the last one, the one that's invisible, is the way each of us thinks, the mental models we hold. Many of us are trained, I include myself in this, to come at the work, to come to social change work thinking, I can see a problem or a challenge or an opportunity. If I do this program, I will get these predictable results. And in fact, that is true, but it is not the right approach for systems change. And the more we bring this sort of very 1 + 2 = 3 approach, the less likely we are to change the system. So some of the work is at a personal level, we need to adopt a systems change mindset, and it's often only you can acquire that mindset through doing the work. It's not through going and studying it somewhere. So how do we engage in systems change work, in trying to shift the patterns and behaviours that we have influence over, to include how we take up our own role. We can practice these things locally and collectively, and they will bring about change. And as we all have, as more people in the system change their mental model to a more aligned way, then we could actually transform the system that benefits children in Australia. So I'm going to leave this slide for you to read at your leisure, because this is putting more words around the different types of interventions in the system. We can intervene at a structural level through resource flows. We can change the rules. This is often around changing legislation or guidelines and policy. But systems are self-organising in some ways. So trying to increase the way that systems self-organise, how they come together, this is the work of collaborating, can change the way the system develops or evolves. Aligning to shared goals can be a very powerful intervention in the system. It's the absolute work of the summit that we're all heading towards. How do we create a national blueprint 10 years long for little children in Australia together, and how do we then all align behind those goals? So once we've determined where the high leverage intervention points are in a system, the work then is to carefully and strategically make those interventions in the system to be intentionally disruptive in a way that does no harm, because we watch, adapt and learn. So if we've determined, you can see on this slide, we've determined what our interventions in the system are. We might be shifting communications and information flows. We might be changing policy and regulation structures. We might be changing relationships and use of power in the system. We need to watch to what extent are the drivers changing, the things that are holding unacceptable outcomes in place, how much are they changing? Once we see changes in the drivers, we see behaviours shift in the system. Less fragmentation, more collaboration, greater sharing of data, intentional power sharing. To what extent are those behaviours now shifting the way that the system operates? And are we seeing more children have better outcomes as a result of a system that is designed around their needs more? So this is a common question that comes up in systems change work, is what is the role of programs in systems change? So what we know is that programmatic interventions are critical in the lives of children, particularly children with higher needs or momentary higher needs, but that programs by their definition provide direct support to a small number of people at any one time. So they are needed because we need to get the best possible programmatic solutions in place so that when people use them and access them, they're getting the best possible outcome. But that alone will not shift the system. So programs are essential but not sufficient to create better outcomes for all children. If we pair programmatic improvement with a systems change strategy, these types of interventions are broader, they're less direct, but they have the potential, if we get the interventions right, to drive long-term improvements for all children, or for a greater number of children over time. So they contribute to population level change. So in thinking about the work of systems change, we're beginning to, we know already, or we're beginning to understand this is long-term collaborative work. So how do you do it? What are the steps? What are the processes? So there's many approaches, and I've listed a few here that are all highly credible and have great literature and practice resources around them. But the most important message is there's no single correct way to do systems change. It's highly context driven. Who are the actors? How well are they connected? How much trust is there? How quickly are they able to influence power, use data to inform the interventions they are collectively doing together? And how quickly can they adapt and learn? So there's no single sort of playbook for systems change, but all of the ways of doing systems change come down to a set of universally agreed things about principles and learning. So the principles are: understand the needs of the population to whom you are trying to benefit. So in our case, very young children in Australia. Understand their needs and their assets. Engage multiple actors across the system. Lots of different perspectives on what is happening for young children and their families. Map the system Either do it explicitly through the system maps we showed some examples of today, or do it intuitively because people are have a lived experience of what the system is. But most importantly, do that together. Do it collectively. Distribute leadership, don't centralise it. So you need the system to change in multiple parts at the same time, concurrently. So leadership must be distributed but aligned to the same sense of goals. And most importantly, foster a culture of learning. Systems change cannot happen without rapid adaptation, rapid understanding of what's changed in the system, and are our interventions still the ones we want to pursue. So when we come to think about the summit, we are coming together to understand the needs and assets of young children and their families. We're engaging multiple actors, 350 to 450 of us are coming together over 2 days. We're going to foster a culture of learning from each other and from what we know about what works in the system now, and we're going to do it together. We're going to unearth some insights and some priorities in the form of a blueprint, a 10-year blueprint for action around for young children and their families, and we're going to distribute leadership around the priorities or the goals that are emerging. So we're going to do some systems change practice together. So if we just finish up this time of me speaking by thinking about what would you expect, knowing that you're coming to a summit focused on changing the system that supports young children and their families in Australia. Some of the things you can expect to get ready is that when you first walk in, there will be wedding seating. So this means we are intentionally seating people at tables to increase the diversity. So you won't sit with your colleagues and friends if you've come with them. You will be distributed across tables, and each table will have the most amount of diversity that we can muster. You can expect that you will be resourced as a participant to engage with very different perspectives. So lightning talks from panelists about what is working well for children and what do we need to preserve in the system. What is not working well for children? What do we need to address, even though addressing that might be uncomfortable? And what are the things we are missing in the system that actually we need to bring in to ensure that better outcomes are enjoyed by more children? So you'll be resourced to engage with different perspectives, different types of knowledge to the knowledge you hold, and to learn from each other. That learning will be supported through dialogue and through strong facilitation at your tables. And you will be part of a developmental process. Across the 2 days, we are going to iterate a national blueprint over 10 years for children and their families. There'll be no time for you to switch off. It will be a very engaging process for the whole 2 days. You will feel somewhat tired at the end of it. But there will be plenty of opportunity for you to keep participating, and if you choose to take up leadership post the summit. So as the blueprint for young children in Australia emerges, there will be opportunities for you to sign up to action groups, working groups, or further development of the agenda. So hopefully the short time that we've been talking today gives you an introductory understanding to systems change, why it's different from a programmatic response to improving outcomes for children. Some of the things, exposure to some of the things that we might be doing together when we're at the summit, but also what to expect as you turn up and as participants in an agenda setting process. So if any of these things we've talked about today pique your interest, or just for reading, for your own reading, or to help you prepare further for the summit, I really recommend these very two accessible documents or thought leadership pieces around systems change. One is, what is systems change, and particularly how does it relate to place-based work? And then that's the Water of Systems Change. And then the other one is a systems change guide to how to do it from very different perspectives, how to do it from government, how to do it from academia, how to do it from service delivery, how to do it from philanthropy. So it's a very short and accessible guide that will speak to the role you play in the system. So that's it from me for now. We're very keen to hear any questions you have either about systems change practice and theory, or about your preparations for the summit. So over to you. What would you like to talk more about?
Thanks, Kerry. It's Penny back from Oracy. That was just so informative, and I think it's really important, for the group that we have gathered, and we're really delighted. We've got a lot of amazing people who are currently engaged with the Early Years Summit, both as panellists, as thought leaders, but also with the people who are just registering to come as the registrations come through. Certainly from Oracy's point of view, and I think from the perspective of our partners, we've been really validated that it is time. Now is a golden opportunity for us to actually be doing this systems change work in relation to improving early childhood development in Australia. So thank you for that. I think knowing that the systems change theory leading into the summit is going to give participants an added advantage and allow them to really, as Kerry said, it's going to be 2 very, very intense days. We're very aware of that, and we've deliberately designed the summit with that in mind. We've seen, we're tired of talk fests. People don't want to just come and talk. They don't want to be talked at, and they don't want to talk for 2 days and that lead to no action. The summit has been purposefully designed that that's not what this is about. This is actually an opportunity for us to work, and we will make you work together for 2 days. We have a number of questions that have come through during the course of Kerry's presentation. We're going to work through those systematically. I've got a couple of members from the Oracy team. We've got Dr. Rebecca Goodhue and Paul Kinderman from Oracy's team here, who are here. Between Paul and Rebecca, myself and Kerry, we'll work through as many of your questions as we possibly can. So over to you, team.
Okay, I'll read this one out. This is from Ashley. Thank you. From a place-based approach in supporting the wellbeing of children, in your view, where is the most important place to start?
Do you want to kick off, Kerry, and then I can have some thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you, Penny. So if you are wanting to improve outcomes for children in your place, the most important place to start is to mobilise the voices and experiences of those who usually do not participate in changing the system. So in this case, children and their families. So you've got to build, so you can start very technically by a very good engagement strategy to get conversation going. Conversation is always enhanced by the use of data so that people can get a set of size and scope of what it is that we're looking to affect change upon. And to build the readiness of families and children to participate in that process. But so that's the technical work. The work that is far more important is to ensure that your place and all of the actors in it who have a stake in children have their capacity built to come together and change the way they work now in order to work differently together to get better outcomes for children. If there are very low levels of readiness, if people are very committed to protecting the current way of working, and have a very low level of openness to learning, then you could do more harm than good by trying to start a place-based initiative when readiness is low. So my advice to you is 2 things. Build the capacity of families and children to participate in large-scale change, and do the work of building readiness across the entire system to come together and work better together for children.
Thanks, Kerry. I think that's great. And I think from my perspective, I would certainly completely agree with everything that you've said, but also to point to people who are listening to today's webinar, there's a lot of great resources about how you can have those conversations, how you can do the engagement work with children, their families, or the people who care for them at a community level that really enables those voices to be captured and to be a key part of the deliberations that you're taking in the work that you're doing. Certainly in the work that we've done to plan for the summit, we went out. It was great. We spent some time talking to some children and young people, in particularly very, very young people in early education and care settings, to find out from them what are the things that actually matter, what are the things that make them feel loved and safe, what are the things that actually help them to feel like they're participating in the community and in the places where they spend spend their day. So we would just encourage you to use those resources. We're a first port of call, but there are a lot of really good organisations who have made those resources available. Another question.
Okay, well, actually, we've got a simple one, Penny, for the minute.
Sure.
And someone's asking, who's it for? Who's the summit for? Is it for lived experienced people? Is it for professionals? What sort of people are we expecting to come to the summit?
Yeah, look, thanks, Paul, and whoever asked that question. It's a great question. The summit is for everyone. I think one of the things that we've really is clear in Kerry's systems theory and in the diagrams that she's presented is that the system is incredibly large. It encompasses all aspects of society. It encompasses people with lived experiences whose voices have to be privileged and have to be heard. But there are many players in these systems, whether they be service providers, whether they be government policymakers, philanthropists play a role in this system, business plays a role in this system. There is a role for everyone in the system, therefore there is a place for everybody at the summit. And we are, as Kerry said, we are going to mix people up at the summit. We are going to play wedding roulette. We don't know who you're going to be sitting with, but as Kerry said, it will be a diverse group of people from a very, very diverse group perspectives. So we're keen to have as many diverse perspectives. If you work in housing and homelessness, if you work in children's services, early education and care, if you work in system resources flows, tax, all of those perspectives are valid and active parts of the system that impacts our youngest children, and all of those perspectives are welcome and actually needed at the summit.
Thanks, Penny. Next one leads into that, I think. Adam agrees that we need to do system change and says, however, without the support of governments, it can sometimes feel like we're screaming into the void. Nicely put. To what extent are governments engaged and involved in the summit and its broader objectives? And how is it anticipated that government will be influenced following the summit?
Such a great question. Thanks, Adam. Look, government has been engaged. We're seeing a really lovely turnout increasingly from state and territory governments from all sorts of departments, particularly health, education and community services. To be honest, we'd love to see more government people coming along. And if there are any government people out there, please, think of this as an opportunity to be part of those conversations. There are a couple of ways that we're hoping governments will be influenced in this process. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware that we are currently in a major reform process around what will replace the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. The summit is a key part of those discussions. We've been working very closely with our colleagues at Families Australia to make sure that the processes are aligned. We're working very closely to make sure that our colleagues at the Department of Social Services, at the Departments of Health, Prime Minister and Cabinet, NIAA, all of the Commonwealth government agencies have been invited. We're keen for them to come along. We want those perspectives in the room. We want to have a frank and without favour conversation about what is currently working and what is not. And we're really asking people to come and participate in those discussions and to be ready to hear. Kerry spoke about that willingness and need to be open to change and not to be set in our ways. And we're asking that from our government participants in the same way that we're asking it from all participants.
Indeed, I think we've got someone from the NDIS on one of our panels.
We do indeed. Peter Donatris from the NDIA is coming along to talk about how early intervention, in particularly in relation to disability, is such a key driver for many families, and how that system, which is complicated, can actually be a key part of interacting with the broader system that impacts children in their earliest years.
Good. Thank you. I guess, could you just step us through, Penny, some of the questions we get generally are related to, so I walk into this thing, what am I going to be doing? How's it going to work? What are the panelists going to do? How am I going to interact with that? What's going to happen to the discussions at my table? How are we going to capture it? How are we going to turn that into something?
Yeah, look, that's a fabulous question. We do get a few of those questions. I'm going to hand over to Kerry initially to do a bit of answering around that, as Kerry's been intimately involved with us in the design of how the days will flow, and then I'll just follow up at the end. So over to you in the first instance, Kerry.
Sure, thanks, Penny. So if you're a participant, as you arrive, you'll be given a table number. At your table number will be, there's a thought leader who will, so you will stay with that table for the entire conference. There's a thought leader who will take up the role of facilitating discussion. and there'll be a knowledge translator whose role it will be to capture the themes, the agreements, the priorities that you debate and discuss at your table, and feed that into the larger diagnostic that's happening in the room. We're diagnosing the system collectively. So you could expect to hear some very stimulating contributions. So there will be panelists of 5 speakers speaking for 8 minutes at a time. The first panel is what is working well in the system that we need to preserve for children. So you'll hear 5 different perspectives on that, and then you'll have time at your table to react, discuss what it is you've heard, what bits you agree with, what bits you disagree with and make you quite uncomfortable, and how you're integrating those different perspectives into your own knowledge. And you'll be supported in doing that. And you'll get another set of stimulus, a set of panelists talking about, if I wrote the blueprint for children, what should it say? So you're going to get different perspectives on what the priorities in the blueprint should be from different parts of the system. So you'll again get time at your table to debate that. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? How are you integrating that knowledge? That's how the beginning of the day one works together. After you've had these sort of inputs into your own thinking, you will have time to work as a table on what do you think the national blueprint for children over 10 years should be. And we start unearthing that collectively and seeing the patterns and themes from all participants. As an agenda, a blueprint will start to emerge from our collective thinking. And we will work that blueprint together over the next remainder of the day and the following day.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I think one of the things that I want to emphasise is the roles that we are putting in place to support your discussions and your thinking. As Kerry said, at your tables, each of your tables will be supported by what we've called a thought leader and a knowledge translator. The thought leaders have come from a very, very diverse group of sectors and settings and parts of the system that we've been talking about, and they will be there to facilitate your discussions. There will be opportunities for them during the course of the summit and for you to hear from them during the course of the summit and their expert perspectives. We have a yarning circle type session on the second day where those perspectives will really be able to be brought to the fore. Each of the tables will have, as we said, a knowledge translator who will be there, a designated scribe in some ways, whose job it is to make sure that your perspectives are captured and the contributions that each of you are making as we work through the summit over the 2 days are actually captured live to our electronic platform that we're using, and that information will be fed into a synthesis process that will be happening with you as well as behind the scenes, and that will be part of the overall creating the blueprint. So there are lots and lots of ways for participants to be able to participate in the discussions. We really are looking for us as a group to be innovative. We're trying to encourage all of those parts of the systems, particularly the unusual suspects, the people who don't often get their perspective incorporated into a national project like this, to actually come to the fore and to use this venue, to use the summit as a chance to have their perspectives heard. That's why it's so important that we have the diverse parts of the system represented, both at the thought leader, the panellist and the participant perspective. We've had a question come through that has asked us, have we invited people from the lever holding state and territory departments and the people who drive funding, who drive policy decisions. I guess I want to emphasise that this isn't an invitation only event. We want as many people to get there as possible. We want people to be able to come and contribute, people who hold those levers, whether they be the visible levers, and we all have control over these non-visible parts of the system that Kerry's spoken about. So if you know somebody in state and territory government who manages your contract or who controls your funding or who you work with on a day-to-day basis, get in their ear. Tell them that they need to come and be part of this discussion because it matters, and it matters to you as a service provider, or it matters to you as an educator, or you as a family. Those are the sort of ways that we can actually make sure that those people get into the room. Do we have any additional questions, Paul?
No, I think between you and Kerry, you've exhausted them.
We've got one coming in.
So how do we know the work we start doing is the right work to keep on doing? What sort of lead indicators do we keep an eye on?
Oh, Kerry, what are your thoughts on that?
That is a cracker question. So the first thing to say on that is that if you're at the summit, you get to influence what is the right work. So that, to me, you're at the heart of your question is, where are the places that we should be intervening that are going to make the most amount of change for the most amount of young children? And that is the work of the summit. Once those priority areas emerge, obviously we won't, the summit will produce a working draft of the blueprint. Once that emerges, there will be a follow-on piece of work that you might want to take leadership or participate in around bringing the blueprint to a finalised position. And then what are the indicators that we need to be tracking, and what are the unintended, like what is the watching and learning we need to do around those interventions, not just the indicators themselves, but around the interventions. Are they working in the way we intended? All of that measurement system needs to be built off the back of that, and will take many people and actually many perspectives to feed that data in. So I think your question's the right one, but it's the work, it's the shared work together in producing the answer.
And I would add to that this is not something that we're in for the short term. This is something that, you know, I think we have to acknowledge that in coming to the place where we are in relation to the early years in Australia at the moment, we're not starting from base. There have been many years of many pieces of significant work at a national level, at a state and territory level, at a community level. There are giants upon whose shoulders we're standing with this work, and I think we really need to acknowledge that and to recognise that. But this is, in the same way that this is not a beginning, it's not an end either. After the summit, there is a lot to be done, and I can say to you that that is something that Eracy is committed to doing for now and into the future, and it's going to take collective, collaborative systems change thinking and work for now and for a period of time beyond the summit, for us to be able to be very clear about what those answers to those questions are and how we're going to be able to track it into the future. And that's something that we're all going to have to join together and do. And that means not just the not-for-profit sector. It doesn't mean government. It doesn't mean just business or philanthropy or service providers. It is actually something that we're going to have to commit to and work to together. And I hope that's what we're able to get at the end of the summit.
We've got a question. I think you've already answered it, but I'll just vote it. These will be our last two questions. What will be done with the blueprint that comes out of the summit? I think you've already touched on that. And the last one is, how will the blueprint be named?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really good question. We haven't talked about that at all. I don't know, but that's probably something that we can actually talk about at the summit, because if we're all going to own it, I think we all need to play a hand in naming it. Great question. What's going to happen with the blueprint? I think we have to be really clear that at the end of the 2 days, we're not going to have a shiny, glossy document that is ready to hand over to the powers that be to be implemented. That's not how it works. We will have the first go at it. We'll have your thinking incorporated. We'll have the thinking of the experts and the panelists and the expert participants and the people with lived experience and the convening group that has pulled together the summit. And that'll be a starting place. But as Kerry said, and as we've said as we've gone along, it's going to take some work. There are going to be bits that need to be fleshed out. There are going to be bits that need to be advanced in different ways. And that's the role of all of us, as all the players in the system. So that's what's going to happen to it. We're going to give it legs, and what that looks like will be determined as we go through the summit. And I'm excited. I think it's going to be it's a fabulous opportunity to bring a whole heap of people who have wisdom beyond we do as single players. And we're hoping that as many of you can join us in that conversation as possible. The more perspectives we have, the better our ability to be able to incorporate thinking and to make sure that we're not ignoring any of those parts of the system. So I do want to finish up by thanking Kerry Graham and her team at Collaboration for Impact. Your wisdom, Kerry, and your ability to understand systems is amazing, and we're so grateful for you to be part of today, and that you and the team are going to be part of the summit. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's been wonderful to be able to share, I guess, our vision for the summit and what we're hoping to achieve and how that's going to play into our systems change agenda. So thanks everyone very much, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as I can at the summit.
And just some house.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, Penny.
Just housekeeping. Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Kerry. This video will be available towards the end of this week. It'll be in our e-bulletin. If you haven't subscribed to that, visit our website and subscribe, and then share the video with as many friends as you can so that we get the broadest possible representation in the room at the summit. The summit is being held on the 11th and 12th of March in Melbourne, and registrations close on the 2nd of March. So there's not much time and places are limited. So please look to registration. And we'll see you all in Melbourne on the 11th and 12th of March. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you.